Hey, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Sunday Unpacked. This is Monica Walmsley. I'm here with Pastor James Jones, and,
Hello.
and we are going to talk about Sunday's service, the impact of a servant, preached by or Pastor Brad Ferris. And
Right. It was a little different kind of Sunday.
Yeah, it was. I want to remind everybody, though, before we get started, that you can text your questions to us to 217-712-6621, and you can email your questions to us at questions@taylorvillechristian.com. And as always, there's your Connect card. So we're talking about Sunday, November 17th, which was just 2 days ago. Um, and again, it was Impact of a Servant, and it was kind of a special Sunday.
Right, because our youth pastor, student minister, Neil Ferris, was ordained. He had been working with us, but he hadn't finished his education and was working through some other things to prepare for that. So now was the time. So we're excited that he made that decision. And along with that, I mean, a lot of guys will choose to be ordained in the church in which they grow up,
Mhm.
sort of their home church. But Neil's been away from the church he grew up in long enough that he felt more connected here than he did there. So he asked if he could be ordained here, which was really awesome and cool for our church because I think people have grown to love him. So it was a neat experience for everybody.
So I I'm not sure really what the purpose of ordination is. What is it all about? I mean, we've talked about it in staff meetings and stuff, but for everybody listening, what would you say it means for someone to be ordained, and what makes it
I,
special?
I think it's a good question because even a couple people asked me Sunday, like, what does this mean? And it really goes back all the way to the Old Testament. I mean, I think the thinking goes back to there, where you have 12 tribes of Israel, and God says, I want you to devote one whole tribe to me. And that was the tribe of Levi. And so the Levites didn't have a land, they didn't have their own place. They lived in and among the people and served as priests, but also religious officials in other ways. And the idea was just like people would bring a sacrifice, like they brought the first crops of the year, the first of the harvest, and that was given to God. And the idea was saying, okay, I did this, I grew it, but it really belongs to God and I'm not going to get the benefit from it, right? I'm not going to be able to sell this to make money. We're not going to eat it to provide for our family. And the tribe of Levi was sort of an offering from the people of Israel to God to serve in the temple. Well, we don't have a temple anymore. We are the temple of God. So it's not exactly the same thing. But the idea is that we're taking certain people in the church and saying these people are not going to work outside to benefit the church. We're going to choose a certain group of people that believe they're called and are gifted to do ministry, and we're going to set these people aside. And that's really what ordain means, is to set something aside for God. And we're going to take care of their basic needs. So we're going to pay them a salary to do ministry. So this whole process was saying Neil feels like he's called by God into ministry, and we are setting him aside in some ways as an offering to God, but for the service of God, service of the church, and service in the community to do God's work. So he's not going to do other work. His work is going to be work in the church. So that's the basic thing behind it. And, different church groups have different requirements. Some are pretty extensive, some are pretty simple, and there's nothing in the Bible that you could turn to and say, here's the requirements. Like elders, you do see that. Deacons, you do see that. So I think it's similar to those. But I mean, we would certainly want somebody of upstanding character. We want somebody who feels like God can use them. We want somebody who feels like they have gifts to do ministry that we see as well. And then education's usually a piece of that, and knowing what the person believes. I think working with Neil has helped. So, because I know him, we've worked together for well over a year now. I've seen how he does ministry. We've had many conversations. So all those things allow us to say this is a person we've identified to set aside for ministry.
It's pretty neat.
Yeah, it's good.
I never knew that. I mean, I knew about the Old Testament and the Israelites and the Levites and all of that, but I didn't really see how it connected to the church
Sure.
today.
Well, we don't talk about very much. So, like,
Mm-mm.
we haven't had an ordination service here at the church since I've been here. So they come along sort of infrequently. So people don't really know exactly what it's about. So
Right.
anyway, it's good to explain it.
Yeah. So how does it affect us as a church family? And
Well,
do
I think it
yeah.
gives us some responsibilities to Neil too.
Mhm.
That we have said we want to set him aside. He's chosen to be set aside, but really there is a connection between a minister and the church that ordains him or her throughout their ministry. I mean, it should be that that church is checking in on him and in some ways holding him accountable to the standards of Christian conduct and there should be an encouraging, uplifting relationship there. It doesn't always work that way. Honestly, the church that I was ordained in nearly died several years ago. And so I honestly don't know anybody in that church now. There's really not anybody there that was there how many ever years, too long to mention, when I was ordained there. So I don't have that connection that I wish I did, but it really is better when that connection remains, throughout that person's
Right.
career.
This it seems like it's a very personal decision to live a life dedicated to ministry. Why is this ordination service a public thing? Why did we do it in front of the whole church instead of just him and his family?
Right, because really it is the church
Mhm.
who makes the decision to do it. So our elders had to say, yes, we want Neil to be ordained as a part of the life of this church. So it's not just a commitment that Neil is making to God, it's really a commitment that Neil is making to God and to the church. And it's a commitment that we as a church are making to Neil, including our elders. But so it is very public in a way because
Mhm.
it's something that we do as a church, not that something that he does just as an individual.
So it's kind of like
It
um,
is, that's right.
a team building exercise, it's a step of faith and a kind of a covenant between us and him, or the church
Covenant
and
is the right
him.
word. Yep.
Okay.
And,
So
one piece that is a good reminder in this is that in truth, all of us, whether we're quote unquote ordained into ministry or not, we are all ministers. Minister just means servant, right? So
right.
we are all called to serve in the life of the church. Now, we may set aside people for quote unquote full time ministry like Neil, but it's not to say, well, the ordained ministers are going to do all the ministry in the church. I mean, every one of us has the right and responsibility to do ministry in the church. It may look different, we may fill different roles, but all of us have some of that responsibility. So it's not to say, well, these are the people who do ministry and then everybody else just shows up. We all have responsibilities there. So it's just a reminder that when we do something like this, we're not saying we have a special class of Christians or, that these people are the only ones who can do certain things. We all have responsibilities together in that.
Well, it's kinda like, the sheep are acknowledging their shepherd,
Yeah,
and
right.
I feel like that's what it seems to be about, or seems to be a good, um, picture of.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. Sure.
So, a saying that we trust you, we trust God, that God gave you to us, and we kind of, commit to praying for you, we commit to supporting you financially, and we commit to, um listening to your teaching and holding
Hmm.
you accountable to make sure that it's, according to God's word. We're gonna check it out, you're gonna check it out. We're all gonna work together to learn and grow and bring the community in. If
Yep, I agree with all
okay,
that. Yeah,
alright.
I think you're exactly right.
Okay. Well, I thought it was very, special to
It
have
was.
Neil's dad preach and bring
Oh
this
yeah,
sermon. That
right.
was like, I just, I wasn't able to be here because I had to work, but when I listened to it later, it just was so, um, just touching It was
It
just,
was.
I could feel the love that Brad had for Neil, and, it was just an amazing thing. I really, really enjoyed listening to it. I wish I could have been here. Um,
Well, it was good because, obviously they do have a close
mhm,
relationship. His dad is in ministry. And um, I thought Brad did a good job I mean, this was a challenge. This sermon was a challenge to Neil, but it was also a challenge to the church. And
mhm.
I thought he did a good job of speaking to Neil in some ways, but also speaking to the rest of us and reminding how this affects us too. And then, his grandfather, which is his mom's dad, was also here and had prayer over him as a part of the ordination itself. So he's got a heritage of ministry, and it was pretty neat for all those things to
Yeah.
be together.
So the sermon was really good too. I thought, it was, about the impact of a servant, and that
Right.
doesn't mean just those who are ordained, like you said.
Right. Right.
He made sure that we all knew, as a congregation, as the body of Christ, that we were also called to be servants. And, just his points, just gonna go over his sermon points real quick. Um, First was when we serve others, love must be the foundation. So we serve out of love. And that the goal must always be glory to God, that giving God glory, it's not about us being the servant, it's about how can God be given glory. Um,
Right.
and that helps the next point come along, which is humility must be the attitude behind the service, and that others must be the target. I just thought that was just great points.
And the one line that I think that he gave that really summed up the whole sermon in some ways was that greatness always serves. I really liked that. I mean, he
Mhm.
talked about, greatness is not about me, it's not about my reputation, it's not about what people think of me, all those things. I mean, if we want true greatness, then it's going to involve real service. And
Mhm.
I thought that was very good.
Yeah. Do you think that serving comes naturally to us as followers of Jesus? Do you think it's just something that
I think there are times that it comes naturally, and I
yeah,
think there are times when it does. And in some ways, these are always questions that I can only answer for me. But
right.
um, there are times when it definitely doesn't, because one of the things that keeps us from serving so often and keeps us from doing lots of things in church is we are just so busy. We have
Mhm.
so many places to be and things to do, and because of that, we lose track of the fact that we may be serving certain, like our family, right? Because we're showing up for them, we're where we need to be for them, and that's really important. So I don't want to take away from that. But we may miss the opportunity to serve others sometimes too, because we're so tied up in the things that we have to get done. Probably there are times that other things get in the way as well. Maybe it's our pride or whatever. But yeah, I think there are times when it feels really easy and natural, maybe because who we're serving. And there are times when it feels awkward and, maybe even unpleasant.
Yeah. Do you think it came easy to the disciples?
My guess is the same for them,
Yeah.
that there were times when it was and times when it was not. We see Jesus feed 5,000, and it's the disciples who pass the food out, right? And it's the disciples who pick up the leftovers, I think. So there are times it was, and then there are times, and Brad mentioned this, when they seem to be concerned about other things, right? Like who's the greatest, not
Right.
who can be the best servant and who can maximize the impact of the power of Jesus at work, but who's going to sit at your right hand? Who's going to be considered the most important? It seems to me that in those moments, they were not thinking about service. And I just even think about their character, right? You've got somebody like Matthew, or Levi, who is a tax collector, an
Mhm.
important tax collector. And he's used to being the person who has the wealth and the person who may look down on others. And so my guess is that was a real change in his role. Now, we don't really know a lot about that, but as far as it coming naturally, I bet it didn't for somebody like Matthew. And there were probably others as well. But certainly some of these people had a life that probably made them feel important before they became disciples of Jesus. And service may or may not have been part of that life. So probably was a challenge.
Yeah. What do you think are some issues in our lives that can make serving difficult? You talked about us being so busy, so our
Busy.
schedule.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we can be a little bit like Matthew, right? If as I said, we don't have examples of that, but maybe in our work position or whatever, we're the person who's in charge, and there are other people who do tasks that if we were at work, we might feel like, well, that's not my role because I'm in this position. They're in their own position, and I'm not the one who cleans the toilets or whatever.
Mhm.
So we can get that sense because of where we are in life, maybe it's a little bit of pride. Maybe it's just we don't want to do those kinds of jobs. I think all those things can get in the way. And sometimes I think one of the things that gets in the way of serving is we don't know what to do,
Yeah.
right? I mean, when some people come to us, we're not 100% sure what the best thing for them really is. And so since we don't know, we just end up doing nothing. Um, so I think some of that's just our awkwardness or lack of knowledge. Some of it's pride, some of it's busyness. I think all those things can keep us from serving in ways that would really matter.
Yeah, and I would imagine, good communication would be needed to serve someone, to find out what their needs are. You have to know their
Yep.
needs, so the
Yep.
communication has got to be there, um,
Absolutely.
or really good discernment in your spirit. I mean,
Yeah. Right.
that's gonna have to be there too.
Yep.
Um, so what can we do or what can I do if my motivation for serving is sometimes because I feel like I have to, and I'm just so busy and so tired, but I really have this obligation that I need to do this. Is God still glorified if I'm and I wouldn't even say that it's half-hearted serving. It's almost like a sacrifice of serving sometimes. I
Mhm.
think maybe it depends on the attitude behind the service.
It does. And I mean, Brad talked about, that love needs to stand behind, love needs to be the
Mhm,
foundation, and we want to glorify God. And we're in some ways we're talking about motivation there. We're talking about what's going on in the interior of our
mhm.
lives, not the exterior of what we're doing. Here's how I would address that. I don't know how Brad would. That's just my thinking. Sometimes we have to do things that need to be done, things that have to be done, things that are the right thing to do, even when we don't feel like it. And
Mhm.
that doesn't necessarily negate the value of those things. It doesn't necessarily negate that God is glorified. In fact, I would say that sometimes it is love itself that creates a sense of duty within us to do something that frankly we may not want to do. I mean, or even maybe we don't feel like doing it.
Right.
So when we think about love, sometimes we think about love being an emotion, and it is, right? I mean, we feel love,
Mhm.
but sometimes love is present, and so we have to do something that we're not emotionally motivated to do.
Okay.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't of value or that we're doing it for the wrong reason. I mean, even in a marriage relationship, right? I mean, I think sometimes a really good marriage is built on 1,000 little decisions to do what should be done, even if it isn't what we feel like doing in that moment. But, on the other side of it, we're going to be really glad that we listened carefully, that we gave the encouragement, that we were engaging with our spouse, even though we might feel a little distracted, even though we might be tired. It's not that I'm not saying we don't want to do those things, but we may not feel like doing them in the moment. But what keeps us doing those things? Well, it's the love we have for that person, and that keeps us making those 1,000 small decisions that really benefit the relationship in the long term. Well, I think that's at work in a lot of ways. And our love for someone motivates us to do the right thing. Um, and it may be in situations that are more difficult than, I mean, our spouse, where we want them to feel good. We want them to be served. We want them to know that we care. And maybe we don't feel that nearly as strongly in lots of other situations, but still the love that's present, God's love for us that's at work in other people, motivates us to do things that we don't feel like doing. That's a long answer to a short
Yeah.
question, but
No, but
um,
I like that it's not sometimes it's not duty, it's love.
right, right,
And the reason we feel the responsibility is because we love.
right.
I like that. I never thought of it that way, so that really that answered my question.
Okay, good.
Okay. So, I think that there are
Let me,
yeah,
before we
go
move
ahead.
on, let me
Yeah,
just one more thought.
yeah.
I think part of what Brad was dealing with too is that sense of, well, I'm gonna perform this act of service, especially in terms of ministry, because it will benefit me, right? Because
Mhm.
it'll lift up my reputation, because people will think bad of me if I don't do it. And that's when that really is more a sense of duty than
Mhm.
love, right? I mean,
Mhm.
and I think that may be a piece of what he's addressing. And that's something we really have to work on. I mean, if what we're doing is done just to create some kind of image for people of a servant, even though we don't have a servant's heart, that's pretty empty.
Right.
And I think that that is a piece of what he was getting at when he talked about that. So anyway,
Yeah,
that's to the side.
yeah, and I think that's where the humility comes in,
Sure.
because it's not about me. This act of
Right.
service is not about me, it's about the recipient, and it's about glorifying God, and I need to get out of my head and out
Right.
of
And
my
it may be
emotions.
that
Yeah,
no one will even know I did it.
right,
And where I'm going to do it because it benefits the other person,
right.
not because people are going to think, "Oh, James is really a good minister because he did this
Mhm.
thing,"
Yeah,
because that's really not the issue there.
yeah. So I think, there are times in our life, not only when we're tired or not motivated to serve, but maybe when we feel too broken to serve. Do you think that God understands that? Do you think that we disappoint him, when we feel too broken to serve, or when we're, you know, feeling too overwhelmed to serve?
I hope that doesn't disappoint God because I'm pretty sure almost all of us get to that point at some time,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, we almost almost everyone, and I would think it's virtually universal. We go through difficult times, and we may feel so broken that there is nothing within us left to give to someone else,
Yeah.
and we have our limitations. We always have to operate within our resources, and that sounds sort of clinical. And sometimes when I say that, I'm talking about money and time, but it also involves emotional energy too, and spiritual energy.
Mm,
And there are some times when we are so depleted that there's just nothing left to give. And God created us with those limits, so I don't think He's shocked when we reach them and then we can't do anything more. So it's hard for me to imagine that God would be disappointed that we get to that point. So I'm pretty sure He understands that.
I feel like that's part of why he created Sabbath.
Sure.
And I don't think that Sabbath is just about resting or sleeping, or just not doing anything. I think did we talk about this a couple weeks ago, or did I? Sabbath is more about a time of refreshing, and we have to have those times of refreshing so that we can be replenished when we feel overwhelmed or when we feel depleted.
Here's what's interesting. That actually ties back into what we've already been talking about because just like the people of Israel brought the first of their harvest,
Mhm.
the first animals, all those things, the firstborn, the giving of a day was basically the same thing.
Mm.
Because, if do you make more money if you work 6 days or 7 days a week? Well, you make more money if you work seven, especially if you're a farmer. If you can work every day, you're going to get more done. But part of what Sabbath was is saying, not only is what I produce God's, my very time and my life are God's. And so I'm going to take one day out of every 7 and I'm going to choose not to work, even though I could. And that day belongs to God. Now, maybe God's going to use that day for spiritual refreshment. Maybe he's going to use it for rest. Maybe he's going to use it so that we have time to study, or
Mhm.
worship, or we could go on and on. I mean, there's lots of things that we could do that would be of value. But the point is, we are saying I'm going to operate with less than I could have because I'm devoting this day to God. And so it really ties back into that same sense of what we were talking about with giving a piece of life to God, because ultimately it's his anyway, and he knows what's best for us.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. So we do have permission to rest.
We do, and even Jesus rested,
Mhm.
right? I mean, it reminds me of in John chapter 6, I mentioned the feeding of the 5,000 a minute ago, but after that, Jesus goes away by himself, and that's not the only time in scripture where we
Are
see
you there?
Jesus go
Okay.
away. And he was God. He was also a human being. And, could it be that Jesus had reached his physical, emotional, and spiritual limits as a human being after those events and needed time by himself? And when he took that time by himself, he could have been preaching, he could have been out there performing signs and miracles, but he took that time and he devoted it to God because he needed that. So I think we not only can see that God approves of that, God demonstrates that for us in the example of Jesus, which I think is a good thing for us. We need that example because we can push ourselves pretty hard if we're not careful.
Mm.
So we need those times. If Jesus needed them, then I know I needed them.
Right. So, when you're in, ministry and you've set aside your life for that, when do you find your Sabbath?
Well, the church here is really good about giving us, I mean, we have Saturdays off, but the church en- encourages us to take one other day of the week because Sunday is a full day. I mean,
Right.
like this last Sunday, I mean, I was at home for an hour here and an hour there, but it was pretty much like 6:45 in the morning till about 6 in the evening. There were activities all day long. So it was a work day, and that's fine.
Right.
But they've said you need to take days. So Leanne and I have Friday off, and I mean, that's been a huge blessing to us over the years that we've had that day where we could spend time together. And if we have something to do around the house that needs to be done, that's fine. But if we want to just go somewhere and be together for that day, that's a big deal for a minister
Yeah.
to have time like that, because there's certainly been times in my ministry when we were barely getting part of Saturday off because the church was not as generous in encouraging that time. And I can tell you that I am a better minister because the church has encouraged that over the years. So I really do appreciate that about our elders in our church, that they give that, because it does allow me to have time when I can disengage from what has to be done here at the church or among people, which is all good work that I enjoy, but I also need time to not do that.
Yeah.
So that's been a blessing.
Well, you need time to refresh before the Lord and just be filled. That it's
Sure.
about you and God
Right.
and you getting replenished so that you can continue to give and serve. So,
Correct.
um, one of my favorite parts about, um, the sermon well, I mean, the sermon was really about serving when Jesus washed the feet of the disciples, and Peter
Right.
found it very difficult to allow Jesus to wash his feet. And I say in typical Peter fashion,
Right.
he went a
And
little
it
bit
is.
overboard and
Yeah.
said, "You're not gonna just wash my feet, or don't wash my feet." And then when Jesus said, "If I don't wash your feet, you have no part of me." And so Peter goes overboard and says, "Well, then wash all of me."
Right.
And he didn't need that. Um, do you have any thoughts or encouragement for those of us listening who may find it difficult to be the recipient of someone else's service?
Well, I know I find that hard.
Yes.
Um, I think it's just partly because of my makeup. I
Mhm.
mean, part of the reason I am a minister is that I wanna be the one doing that. I wanna be the one to meet those spiritual needs, and so it's a little hard for me to reverse that and be on the receiving end, though I've experienced the generosity and servants of Christians all the way through my ministry and certainly here at TCC. So that's been I've been blessed with good people. So it's not for a lack of people serving and encouraging and all the things that I've really needed over the years, but it is hard for me to receive it. It's a challenge for me, and maybe it's that sense of pride that I want to be the one to sort of control that process of who's
Mhm.
giving and receiving, or maybe it's that I don't want to be indebted to someone who has given to me in a time when I couldn't give back. I don't even know exactly what all
Yeah.
that is within me, but I know I do struggle with it. But you know, I think we have to put that on the other side that when we are attempting to serve someone else, when it is graciously received, it's a blessing to us, right? I
Mhm.
mean, when I can do something when we take a meal to someone and you can tell they number 1 really appreciate it, number 2 really enjoy it. Well, that's a great blessing to me, and it's certainly not that I feel that they're indebted to me. So if I get sick, boy, they better bring a meal to
Mhm.
my house. I don't feel that at all. But it's a blessing that they have enjoyed something that I've done for them. So when I have to sort of make myself put the shoe on the other foot or whatever analogy you want to use there and say, okay, if it's a blessing when other people receive my service, then I need to allow them to feel a blessing that they have served me in some way, that they have blessed me in an important way. So I really have to reverse that thinking, like intentionally, to be sure that I show my appreciation. Because in some ways, I don't like the attention of being served. I don't like to be noticed. I'd rather be the one to do that.
Mhm.
So it's a challenge, and I think it does require some intentionality if anyone's like I am and is resistant to that.
Yeah, I think it takes humility to
Yes,
receive
right.
as much as it should be given with humility.
Hmm.
And and I think that is the beauty of it when acts of service are given and received with humility and love, and just both sides are blessed beyond measure. I think
Yep.
that that is such a beautiful part of serving, it
Yep.
truly
Totally
is.
agree.
And that's probably one of my, biggest takeaways from going on a missions trip, is the
Mm,
humility it takes to serve and give and love, and the humility with which it's received, I
yeah.
believe, and that just the beauty of that is amazing. So back to Jesus and washing the disciples' feet. How significant is it that Jesus also served Judas, knowing that Judas would soon betray him? And what
It's
lessons
it,
can we learn from this?
it's shocking,
It
right?
is, yes.
I mean, how did he do that? Um,
Yeah.
Knowing, I mean, did he give Judas a knowing look in that moment that, because Jesus knew what was about to
Mhm.
happen, but yet he did it anyway. It's what it is love, right? I mean,
Mhm.
if Judas had repented somewhere along the way, I fully believe that Judas would have been forgiven of what he had done.
I agree.
And
Mhm.
um, maybe Jesus thought, I mean, Jesus knew the future, but I mean, maybe this gave an opening for Judas to change his mind, to recognize that this was not
Mhm.
the right path. I don't know. There's lots of things, ins and outs. So
Yeah.
I don't want to get too caught up in the what ifs of that,
Right.
because God had a plan. But point being, Jesus still showed the same kind of love as God, as really the creator. We know Jesus was present in creation. We learn that in John
Mhm.
chapter 1. And so Jesus was involved in the creation of each human being, whether it's you and me or whether it's Judas.
Right.
And so he had the same love for Judas that he has for me, and I'm just as much of a sinner as Judas. Um, and so he showed the same love that he did for those other 11 men who were imperfect as well, and who
Right.
would all walk away from him that night. Peter, who would deny him, the one who's ready for Jesus to wash all of him, is going to deny that he knows Jesus. So not one person in the room was perfect, and Jesus loved all 12 of them, including Judas. And it is remarkable.
I feel that same way, and the fact that he treated him with love, knowing that he was gonna betray him, and he never gave up on
Right,
him. Jesus
right,
never gave up on him as long as there was breath in Judas's lungs. Jesus was gonna love him,
right,
and
right.
that
Totally agree.
and that is such a beautiful example of grace and or mercy in action, I guess, I don't know,
Yep.
but yeah.
Mercy, humility. I mean, all
Yes,
love, all these
it
things
was
that
just
are at the core
gentleness,
of who
yeah,
Jesus is. Yeah.
yeah. So, how do we get past the feeling that some people don't deserve acts of service because they've treated us, someone we love, or the church, fellow Christians, poorly? Or we feel like they've taken advantage of someone's service and grace in the past?
Well, it's super hard,
It
right?
is, yeah.
Um, I mean, what we're dealing with here at the core is forgiveness. And
Mhm,
as people at TCC have heard me say, I talked a lot about forgiveness when I was young in ministry, and then actually had something to forgive and found out, oh, it's really a lot harder than I thought.
mhm,
And anyone who's been involved in ministry, whether you're ordained or whether you're just volunteering in the church, is going to find moments when you sense just these things.
mhm,
Sometimes it's more severe than at other times, but you're bound to sense this. So I think it's a real challenge. I mean, the church is, we find all these images, the body of Christ, it's the family of God, it's community of faith, all those things, but it is also flawed. It's imperfect because we are flawed and we are imperfect and we're sinners. So we have to do over and over as the church the really hard work of forgiveness, and not just forgiveness, reconciliation. And forgiveness is one thing because in some ways I can do forgiveness all by myself, right?
mhm,
So if you say something that really just hurts me, I don't really have to talk to you about it. I can just work on that forgiveness on my own. But the reconciliation might require us to talk. And that can be uncomfortable because there's conflict, there's confrontation,
mhm,
there's all those things. Um, I was reminded recently a couple times of the passage that says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." And the work of peacemaking is never easy stuff, whether we're talking about making peace between two parties that are external to us or whether we're talking about making peace between me and someone else. And so, you know, I don't think we take it lightly when we feel like there are people who, like, they don't deserve my service because of the way they've treated me or the way they've treated people I love or the way they've sort of abused the church. And that can take years and decades, if I'm honest, to get over. Um, but of course, we only feel better about it when we can work through those things. So I think it is making the decision to forgive, and if possible, finding some kind of reconciliation between us and that other person or group of people. And usually these things work better one on one than in groups of people. Uh, so I think this is important because I used to think if there was ever conflict in the church, it was because, oh, things are wrong, things are messed up. And then you realize it's just going to happen at times because
mm,
we have different approaches and sometimes we don't handle our emotions well. And so it's not like we're going to get to some right place and then we're not going to ever have conflict. We're not going to ever have these things, hurt feelings, because now we've got it figured out. Well, that's never going to happen.
right,
So what we're going to have to do is figure out how can we be the church even though we're in the middle of whatever conflict it is? And then, when we do it right, then we become a witness to other Christians around us, maybe even the community, that, oh, Christians actually do deal with this stuff and do forgive each other. Whereas when I look in the world, they're not very good at it.
Right.
So when we do this, we have a witness for who Jesus is. So I don't have any there's no easy answer to
No.
that question. It's a great question, and I can't give you, well, here's what you do, 2 steps and it's done,
Right.
because there's emotions involved
Yeah.
and
Well, I think it's important to point out too that these are just, I don't wanna say every day, but these are just your typical disagreements and stuff. This is not abuse we're talking
right,
about.
no,
This is
correct, absolutely,
this
yeah.
is definitely not, uh, abuse. This is
No,
just
no,
your,
it's
conflict of, and arguments and things like that. This is
right.
not a difference of opinion, difference of approaches, difference of teaching methods. This is
Yeah,
what we're talking about. We're not
we
talking
should
about abuse.
never
Right.
we should never put ourselves in a position where someone's gonna, we know that we're gonna face some kind of abuse, whether it's verbal or physical or anything else.
Right.
So,
And
yeah,
boundaries in that situation, boundaries and the
he's
possibility that you're gonna find peace in yourself and not necessarily resolution of the
right,
situation. So,
right.
I think it's important to point that out when we talk about that.
It is, absolutely.
And
Yep.
we would be remiss if we thought those things don't happen to Christians because they do.
Well, they do.
Yeah,
They absolutely do.
and it's
Yeah.
sad, but anyway, back to the sermon. Sorry, I just really always feel like I have to add that part because there's
No,
so
no, I
much
think
going
we have
on.
to.
Yeah. There was a point in the sermon, and I was ahead of myself earlier when I said this, but I loved when Brad contrasted Luke 22 and John 13.
Right,
And you alluded to it earlier as well. And this was about the disciples, they were disputing about who was greater or who was the
right, and this all
greatest.
happens at the same meal,
Yes.
right? The way Brad
Yeah.
describes it,
Yeah.
yeah.
I loved it. And it actually did clarify for me what, the whole text about servants, masters, and greatness meant in John
Mhm.
13 through 17. If those guys who walked the earth with Jesus had difficulty grasping and living this concept of a servant's heart, life with a servant's heart, is this something we can expect to get right every time, or how do we give ourselves
Uh,
grace when we've
no,
been less
I
than
mean, yeah.
servant-minded?
Getting something right every time is,
Is that's
not a
yeah,
possibility
no,
anyway, right?
yeah.
Um, the one thing that changes with the disciples that we have to keep in mind
Mhm,
is when we get to the day of Pentecost, they are filled with the Spirit of God. And that should change something about who we are. So
mhm,
we do see a change in them from the time that Jesus is teaching them to the time that they become church leaders. Now, again, that doesn't mean, oh, well, we are filled with the Spirit of God, so we'll be perfect. We won't be. But we need to depend on the Spirit of God
yeah,
in our work. We need to allow God's Spirit to be at work in us and hopefully help us to be the right kind of servants and be less concerned about who's the greatest and more concerned about how can I serve the people around us. I mean, you always ask as a part of our podcast, what was the most powerful, the most meaningful part of the sermon? Well, you've already come to it for me. I mean, this was the piece that, like, it taught me something I didn't know, and like you said, connected some things that made that whole scene make sense.
mhm,
So I thought that was excellent.
yeah,
Um, this sense that the disciples were asking this question about who's the greatest. Jesus did verbally answer that question. Well, he challenged them for asking it, really,
mhm,
but he demonstrated. He didn't just talk about it. He
right,
showed them how they should be thinking about greatness rather than, okay, who gets to sit in the seat of honor, who has the power, who's going to be respected, that this is ultimately about service. So I thought that was the moment in the sermon that really drove things home for
Yeah.
me. I thought that was excellent.
Same here.
Yeah.
So, what is the best way that we, the body of Christ, can pray for our leaders in the church? Like for you and Leanne, for Neil and Mary, for our staff that's here day in and day out, even the
Yeah.
school staff, you know?
Well, there's so many pitfalls in
Mhm,
ministry, right? And we've been witnesses of some of those
mhm,
pitfalls, both personally and you know, things that we've heard about in other churches.
mhm.
So I think there's a multitude of ways to pray, but ultimately it's that God would keep us whole, right? That He would keep us where we need to be in our relationship with Him, and that we would find encouragement in the power of God at work in us. Because I mean, there's a lot of pressures in ministry that I think come as much from the culture as they do from the church. That we always assume that an organization that's bigger is always better, right?
Mhm.
I mean, if it's a business, if they're selling more, then they must be more successful. If a church is a bigger church, then it must be a more successful church. And there's something to be said for growth and expansion. I'm not discounting that. And I'm thankful that our church has grown a good bit in the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah,
But that can also make ministers feel like, well, this church over here that's doing bigger things and better things is way more successful, which must mean that their minister is more capable and is really better at what he or she is doing. So I think it's that sense of encouragement, that sense that God is at work, sense of spiritual wholeness, that God would keep our ministers from temptation. I mean, all those things.
yeah.
You go on and on and on, but really, the relationship with God's the most important thing.
Okay. Appreciate that. That should help some of us know how to pray for our leaders in our church. Um, if you guys have comments or questions, I hope you will text or email us. Fill out the Connect card, 217 for a text. And email is questions@taylorvillechristian.com. Connect cards are available every Sunday. I just so much appreciate your time and doing this podcast, James. It's just one of the highlights of my week. I hope you enjoy
It's been a
it.
blessing. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
been a blessing to me. Hope it's a
Uh,
blessing to the people who
oh,
listen
yes,
too. Yeah.
exactly. So, well, let us know how y'all are doing out there, and we will have a new podcast for you next week. Until then, bye.
Bye bye.